the manosphere is a response to feminism's power over society, and you'll notice that the discourse surrounding adolescence is infused with the kind of feminism that people like Stella Creasy would pronounce. It feels that there is just nowhere that boys can be accepted as boys.
Adolescence has been praised as a fantastic piece of drama. Now, just to give people an idea of what Adolescence is, it's a TV show made by Netflix, which has been promoted by the Prime Minister, which depicts a young 13-year-old boy murdering a girl. And there are various reasons behind this, partly because of social media and so-called Andrew Tate's influence on young boys. The Guardian praised it as a necessary antidote to toxic masculinity. Was there anything useful or any kind of interesting message to you from Adolescence?
Yeah, Adolescence was a very fascinating and powerful piece of art, actually. And it's easy to assume that because certain ideologically left-wing people are saying, well, this is good, then it must be bad or negative. Because the thing that I noticed in the piece was that actually ideology doesn't play a huge amount of, it doesn't play a huge role in the actual events of the story. So for anyone who hasn't watched it, essentially a 13-year-old boy, a young lady, a 13-year-old girl, takes a nude photo of herself for a boy that she likes. This boy shares it around the school, and because the boy's name is Jamie, the murderer, thinks that she's embarrassed by this publicly, and so he thinks, well, now's a good time to ask her out because maybe she'd be more interested in me than otherwise. And she laughs at him and rejects him, and then goes on a bullying campaign against him on social media, on Instagram, in front of presumably their entire peer group, calling him an incel among various other insults, and encouraging a cyberbullying campaign against him. In response to this, he then goes and confronts her. They have an altercation in the car park. She pushes him to the floor after he grabs her, and then he gets up and then stabs her, which is the event shown in the film. And then you're shown the difficulty of the boy to understand his own actions and his family trying to grapple with what's happened here. The idea, the toxic ideology of the manosphere and Andrew Tate are mentioned in passing, but are never substantively shown to be a part of the actual events of the drama. And the young man in question is actually the victim of the weaponization of the concepts of the red pill and the manosphere and Andrew Tate and the term incel, rather than someone who is a believer in these things, which he rejects in the series. And so the ideological component of it is actually back to front in the public discourse about the subject. The 13-year-old boy is the victim of being bullied on the principle that there is something called the manosphere, and I can call you that to hurt you.
Okay, for people who don't know or read about the manosphere or Andrew Tate or anything like that, you've obviously had a really interesting involvement in this world, if I could put it like that. Obviously, you have a YouTube channel, you're very big on YouTube, you were very influential for a lot of young men, maybe even millions of young men, in your videos criticizing feminism and so on. What's your view of how the drama depicts young boys, and also more generally in the media with Keir Starmer, the kind of mainstream view of young men, their so-called radicalization, and the manosphere?
So I don't consider myself to be a part of the manosphere because I'm married and I have 4 children. I'm part of, I guess, what I call the dadosphere, and that's really why this sort of thing concerns me. The manosphere is a response to feminism's power over society, and you'll notice that the discourse surrounding adolescence is infused with the kind of feminism that people like Stella Creasy would pronounce. The entire fulcrum of the discourse is around the concept of misogyny, but in fact that's not really a core concept in Adolescence. And in fact, in episode 3, where Jamie is sat down with the psychologist who is trying to press him about his views on women, it's actually very interesting because it would seem as if it's been written from the perspective of someone who thinks that the feminists are doing a bad job at what they do and trying to interject their agenda into subjects where it's not relevant. Because she tries to grill him on the concept of masculinity and his opinions of women, but actually Jamie is portrayed as quite a normal 13-year-old boy who likes women just fine and just thinks his dad is the average embodiment of a man. And so in episode 4, they try to in some way cast aspersions on the father, but the thing is, the father is portrayed as a very loving husband and a good dad who shows a lot of affection towards his son. So it doesn't work. And so coming back to your question more directly, like I said, I'm not a part of the manosphere, but I am aware of it and its influence on feminism itself. Because I think what the manosphere broadly represents is a growing cohort of men who feel very dispossessed by the way that modern society is and want some way of at least expressing that. And because it's on the internet, it tends to spawn memes, and memes are really just shorthand code for much larger concepts, much more complex concepts. And in fact, this is actually very well represented in Adolescence, especially in the way that the girl bullies the boy, using just literally emojis, but the emojis are laden with meaning. The symbols, a staggering amount of meaning in them. And the manosphere is essentially modern man's attempts to grapple with this. Just to go off a little bit on a tangent, one of the main issues I think that is revealed with Adolescence is just how inhuman the system is. The entire system, everyone in it seems to struggle with it because the system is trying to turn them into automatons, into robots, it demands of them that they be emotionless and impartial when such a thing is probably not strictly possible. And you can see the human toll that it has on everyone involved. It's really quite terrible, actually, when you watch it, because you start to wonder, is this an accurate representation of how our schools are run? Is this an accurate representation of how the police are run or how the psychologists operate? Because essentially everyone in it ends up breaking down crying because of what they have to do to maintain this kind of system. And then on the other side of that, you see how the system is repeatedly failing. I can't remember the name of the character who's the main police officer, but he has to go into the school to try and find more evidence and find out more information. And at one point, it's his own son who comes to him and says, look, this has been happening on Instagram, because all of the peer group around this girl who had been killed are very, very reluctant to speak to the police because they've been engaging in the bullying of Jamie as well. And obviously they didn't think that this was going to be the result of it. So in some way, they obviously feel guilty. And it's the police officer's son who explains to him the coded language that they're using in the emojis and on Instagram that has essentially brought things to this point. And after leaving the school is presented in a terrible way. There's no discipline. There's no active. There's no enforcement of real boundaries. I mean, you hear children in the school telling their teachers to shut up, and there's no punishment. I mean, such a thing would have been unthinkable when I was that age, because if nothing else, the fathers would have imposed severe discipline. And coming out of it, the police officer says, I hate this school, I hate this place, I can't believe anyone learns here. Because the whole, like, every single part of the system that we're presented with is completely dysfunctional and is geared towards achieving some end goal that is not really a very human end goal.
The show's creators have been criticised for not depicting an accurate representation of, for example, knife crime in Britain today. This, as you say, it shows a very kind of white middle class stable family and a young boy who seems pretty stable then going on to commit one of these crimes. I'm going to quote from Jack Thorne, the show's writer. He said that Jamie, now as you said, this is the boy that committed the murder, comes from a good background like me. He's a bright boy like I was. The key difference between us he had the internet to read at night, whereas I had Terry Pratchett and Judy Blume. Now, Do you agree with Jack Thorne there that if Jack Thorne had access to Andrew Tate when he was a kid, he may have turned into a knife wielding murderer?
I mean, I think he can only speak for himself on that. But I think the issue is that society is very different now. One thing I worried about is that there are many people at the moment saying, well, I mean, Keir Starmer mistakenly called Adolescence a documentary twice, actually. And there are many people who are taking this as a literal representation of reality, which is what actually fiction is meant to be, a kind of alternative reality that represents our own. And one thing that worries me is if this is accurate to at least some people's experience of life, then it shows that there's something terribly wrong with the country, because the entire series is essentially unisex. It doesn't seem to recognize genuine differences between men and women. And so when the psychologist is interviewing and interrogating Jamie over how does he feel about women, well, all of the women represented are just different kinds of men, really. They're just doing the same jobs as men, and there's no particular difference between them. We never see any kind of gender segregation in Adolescence, which when I was young, and it was only 25 years ago now, when I was at school, there were still things that were gender segregated. And so there were still areas that were boys only and girls only. And this gave you a more concrete understanding of what it was to be a boy and then leading into a man, and what it was to be a girl and leading into a woman. And also there was many more male teachers in the schools when I was young. Now I think it's something like 3/4 of all teachers are women. So actually many young men are being taught by women who, I'm sure with the best will in the world, but can't really understand what it's like to be a young man in the same way that men don't really understand what it's like to be young women. And so these kinds of daily representative relationships that they have, if it may well be that if the author of the piece, I can't remember his name now, was raised now, then maybe he would turn into something similar to Jamie. But when I was young, the same problems didn't persist, because not only was there an understanding that boys and girls are different, but there was areas of society where boys and girls could go. Like, for example, if I went to the Scouts, and I did, it was just boys in the Scouts, and the girls went to the Girl Guides, and that was understood to be an acceptable thing. Whereas now, after at least a decade of modern feminism ravaging our social lives, it feels that there is just nowhere that boys can be accepted as boys, and girls can be accepted as girls or as boys, or at least some sort of facsimile of boys, in any environment. And any thought to the contrary is considered a form of misogyny, without understanding that actually to deprive young men of man-only spaces where they get to deal with older men as mentors, as guides, is a form of man-hatred. And that's not been good for them. And that's why people like Andrew Tate even exist.
I suppose the point that I was making, or that many have made about the show, is that it depicts a knife crime, a murder of a young girl, in a way that is just completely unprecedented. There's no example, in Britain that this has happened before, where a young kid who comes from a stable middle-class family is watching videos from the so-called manosphere and goes on to murder a young girl. That just doesn't. And the writers have even said, one of the writers said, this was not based off any real life case. So I suppose the criticism is that the reality for many people in dealing with knife crime is that the people who are perpetrating these types of crimes come from broken households in poor areas of London or big cities, potentially fatherless homes, and it's just a complete fiction as to the reality of knife crime in Britain today.
So as I understand it, the author did mention that there were 3 particular examples: one in Liverpool, one in London, I think it was Leeds or Wolverhampton was the other one. 2 of these are committed by young white men, and they don't seem to be they don't seem to be based on anything ideological, as far as I can tell. But the thing is, it's actually quite difficult to find details about these things because a lot of the details about the perpetrator had been withheld because they were under 16. But you are right to say that this is not a case of people watching videos online and being radicalized into a hatred of women, but it actually doesn't say that in Adolescence either. There's no indication that Jamie actually watched any Andrew Tate videos, even though I don't think that's what Andrew Tate is suggesting either. But let's assume worst case scenario. There's no evidence that Jamie had been watching anything of the manosphere. And in fact, in the text, he actually rejects the concepts of the manosphere. Like, for example, one of the things they bring up is the 80-20 rule, which is something that was revealed from dating sites, which are a bad barometer of anything. That 80% of the women message 20% of the men, and that means 80% of the men aren't getting any results because they're average. And this is something that Jamie openly rejects in the series, where he says, "Well, look, I don't think that only women are only attracted to 20% of men," and so you can see that he is not in that sphere, and he's not a devotee of that ideology. And in fact, he is in fact the victim of it. And it's the ideology being weaponized against him that is the form of the bullying. So you are correct. There's no example of that to my knowledge. But that's not even claimed in Adolescence through the actual substance of it. What that is the kind of discussion that the adults around are having. And if anything, it kind of indicates, obviously by accident, I guess. I don't know if the author of the piece intended this. But it actually indicates that the adults are just not having the conversation that is relevant to the children. The children are struggling with access. The problem that social media provides is access. Instant access to one another, 24 hours a day, in front of a crowd of potentially thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions. Anyone in the world could see what they say to one another. And so bullying is far more intense to young people now than it ever was in my day. I mean, in my day, okay, maybe half a dozen people were trying to bully you or something. Bad, but not the end of the world, and you could walk home and you'd be on your own and they'd be away. But now it could be in front of everyone in the entire school, and it can be 24/7. So I think that's the real issue with the Adolescence is highlighting. Andrew Tate really is a peripheral thing in it.
It sounds like you agree with the Prime Minister and with the show's creators, perhaps for different reasons, that this should be shown to children or in Parliament or whatever. I think it's an age 15, so I don't think it can even be shown to kids younger than that, really, or it shouldn't be, at least. But so it sounds like you think that this is a worthy drama with lots of interesting points, and you think it should be shown widely. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I would say I think it should be shown, because again, it really misses the difference between young men and young women. Young women tend to be more conformable to systems than young men. Young men tend to be more independent. And I know that when I was young, if we were sat down and say, right, you have to watch this, what is essentially some sort of public service announcement from the government or the teacher or the authority, we would have at best seen it as, okay, well, we're not going to do any schoolwork for an hour or for the afternoon, and we would have just mocked it and not taken it seriously. Because this kind of browbeating isn't how you win young men over to your cause. You've got to give them something to be invested in, and something with which they can be competitive with one another in. Because young men are actually really competitive in a good way, not in an unpleasant way as well. They like to feel invested directly in things rather than preach to. And if you preach to them, they'll just turn off because it's clear that you don't really respect them as young men, and you're just trying to make sure they stay within a certain set of boundaries, which is unlikely given how many of them, and it's very clear that many of them feel that society is stacked against them. They feel that things are not actually very favourable towards them because they are young, straight, white men. And that's hardly fair. I mean, if we live in a society that Adolescence portrays as essentially falling apart and serving a system that everyone inside of it hates, and it's designed basically to stigmatize half of our children, maybe we want to consider changing the system.
This show has prompted lots of discussions in the media, and obviously we're contributing that to today. But Caitlin Moran, she's a feminist. she was on another radio station talking about this, and she said that Andrew Tate is to boys what the body positive movement was to girls in the 2000s, or the body image culture movement, that is. So essentially, she's talking about anorexia and things like that. And she also said that there's no HR department in schools for boys. She implied that would be a good thing if there was. She talked about an example, I think, from her own life where a young girl was asking her friends or school peers for photographs for some kind of school book or something. And the girls all sent in lots of lovely photos from the last few years at school. And the boys just sent in hardcore pornography and thought it was hilarious. And she also complained that there was no progressive men's movement. She talked about Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson as being on one side of the argument, but there's no kind of alternative to those men for boys to look up to. Can you just respond to that sort of those quotes from Caitlin Moran there about, just generally about feminism, about what's attracting young boys and the problem with young boys today?
Yeah, Mrs. Moran is basically correct that there is no movement for young men or boys, but that's only because there can't be, because our society is a unisex society. It's predicated on everything being the same for everyone. And in fact, it's quite clear that young men are very different to young girls in the way that they react to things. The example of send me in some nice photos for the yearbook and the boys didn't take that seriously is a good example of this, because that's just not the way that boys build community amongst themselves. Boys are team-based and competition-based. And so if you wanted to create something that was incorporative to young men and was something they could buy into, it would be a kind of team-based competition that would be quite physical, probably, which is why sports has always been such a boy-dominated activity. But the thing is, that's often not something that women particularly want. A lot of women don't want that. And so it's different for those people. But Caitlin Moran is actually correct when she says that Andrew Tate is kind of the body positivity movement for young men. But what does that tell us? Because the body positivity movement is you look fine however you are. You are intrinsically valuable however you are.
Hold on. Let me come in here. I slightly misspoke and I tried to correct myself in the question. She compared Andrew Tate to the body image movement, and I think this is in relation to trying to get young girls to be thin and to be kind of anorexic so she's talking about those magazines in the early 2000s which promoted like really skinny models and caused kind of young women to be anorexic.
You there. That's interesting. I don't think maybe she's correct, but the point that I think is the important point here is that Andrew Tate is trying to get young men to be something, whereas Caitlin Moran's position is that young women are sufficient however they are and they just want to be accepted. Well, for young men to be accepted, reality has to kind of match up to what their expectations are, and so they need to end in a different place to the one which they began, which is kind of the difference between men and women. Like, a lot of young men understand that they're insufficient as young men. They're not necessarily respected, but it's the work that they put into whatever they're doing that makes them respected. And so to have a path in life and a goal and a hierarchy that they can climb is how young men feel like they belong and as if they should, as if they can congratulate themselves. And that's what Andrew Tate represents. To them, Andrew Tate represents a man who has climbed the social hierarchy. He didn't begin as a champion MMA fighter or incredibly rich supercar owning person. He began, in fact, many ways like them, from a broken home in Luton, with a lot of people around him who probably weren't very nice to him. And he has, through his persistence, got himself to the point where he is now rich, famous, and, famous all over the world, and perceived to be in some way socially powerful. And I think that's the problem that they have with Andrew Tate, and will always have with Andrew Tate, is that and I've seen them try and say, no, we need positive role models for young men. Well, until you can show that society can view men as a worthwhile addition, as men and not just as defective women or domesticated men, then I'm afraid Andrew Tate's going to forever haunt the current paradigm. Until you can say there is something worthy that men and only men can do, women are expressly forbidden from it because they are women, in the same way that I'm expressly forbidden from a bunch of things that women do because I am a man, and that's absolutely appropriate. Until that thing comes into being, then Andrew Tate will always be a thorn in their side. And because we live in such a feminist society, I don't think such a thing's on the horizon.
I think what scares them is that Andrew Tate has so much influence. And obviously, he promotes very materialistic things to do with sex, cars, money, wealth, things that I'm assuming you know, are completely opposite to. As you said, you're in the dad sphere and he's in the manosphere. You're promoting quite different philosophies there. So he does have millions and millions of followers, but not just him. The other people that they're concerned about, like Caitlin Moran mentioned, is Jordan Peterson, has a massive audience. And in America, the Democrats and the kind of more liberal media here are very, very worried about someone like Joe Rogan and his influence on young men. Because they saw in November last year, Donald Trump won, obviously, his election victory in part because of young men who turned out massively for Donald Trump and for the Republicans. And they blame this on figures like Joe Rogan, who has a huge influence. And they asked many questions after the election, where's the left's Joe Rogan? Where's the left's kind of man or sort of masculine figure? What do you make of the Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson? I hate like lumping them all together, but there is a certain theme. What do you make of their influence? Why do you think they're so influential? And yeah, can you just comment on Andrew Tate's philosophy and where you might differ with him?
So it's not fair to characterize Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan alongside Andrew Tate, just to, not that it's you that's doing it, but it is commonly done. And it's not a fair thing at all because they're not in any way the same. Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan both married men with children and successful careers. Andrew Tate is something of a maverick philanderer, should we say, at the sort of most charitable and possibly a sex trafficking criminal at the worst. As I understand it, he's still under allegation, hasn't been convicted of anything, so I don't want to make any statements that might turn out to be false. But the point being is Andrew Tate is living something of a rude boy lifestyle, I guess we might call it. The purpose of life is, as you said, materialistically to amass as much money, as many supercars and as many women as you can, which is a dramatically different lifestyle to the sort of lifestyle that Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and I guess myself are living, which is we're married, we're very happily married to the wife, and we're raising our children and trying to do the best we can for the society in which we live. The difference really couldn't be more staggering, but the similarity, I think, is what's more important, because not so much Joe Rogan, but what Jordan Peterson and I suppose myself are both saying is that actually there is a dignity that should be ascribed only to men, a kind of dignity that should be ascribed only to men. And that, I think, is found properly in fatherhood. Whereas Andrew Tate is saying that the dignity of men is found in being a licentious conqueror, perhaps. But again, it's the kind of dignity that's only found with men. Women aren't privy to this because they're women, and men aren't privy to other kinds of dignity that women are privy to. And the fact that there is a shared philosophy, that there is a space in life for men that has dignity just for men, men alone, is what binds them. It's not actually the substance of their philosophy. It's just the kind of foundational principle from which they act. And it's this foundational principle that feminism has spent its entire ideological career attacking. Because if there is something that is just for men, even if that is merely a position of honour rather than anything material, well, that means that in fact the genders are different and separate, and it is appropriate to have separate areas of life for both men and then for women. And this is what feminism has been trying to undo since day one. As far as feminism is concerned, men and women are essentially the same in their basic makeup, which is why women can replace men in anything. And it's misogynistic to have an objection to that.
If you had the opportunity to make your own TV show, a big Netflix hit, covering the same issues as adolescence, how would you portray it, particularly with young men and so on?
I think I did basically the same. I actually think that Adolescence was a well-meaning and properly extrapolated interpretation of the subject. The fact that Jamie doesn't, I mean, it would have been so easy for them to have just pulled up his search history and said, "Oh, look, he's been watching Andrew Tate videos." That's the problem. And because what the problem with Andrew Tate is that he is not the author of any of these problems. He is downstream of all of the social problems that we have. The alienation people feel from their own society, which again was really well portrayed in Adolescence, is a real problem. The lack of a position of dignity in society, which is again well portrayed in Adolescence, is a real problem. Like, for example, many of the people around Jamie were women with authority, and okay, that's fine, but they can't relate to young men, and young men can't relate to them. And so once again, it's another stage of alienation of young men from their own society. And so I'm not really sure I'd change anything, actually. I don't know if the author of the piece really even understood how well he was transmitting a particular kind of message that could be considered to be sympathetic to young men.
Many feminists and campaigners today would argue that men, as we mentioned earlier, are influenced by what's called toxic masculinity, and that they don't express their emotions enough, and that men need to cry more. What do you make of this idea that men, young boys, are not expressing themselves enough and need to be more emotional?
This is what women say to other women, because this is how women feel about how emotions are properly processed. Whereas men, I don't think, process their emotions in the same way. In fact, it's a kind of humiliation ritual to try and make a young man cry when he is going through a trauma of some sort. It's not that they can never cry or anything like this, but it's undignified for them, and they know it, and they would prefer it if they weren't crying, and they would prefer it if there was some other way than blurting out one's feelings. That's not generally how men express themselves. Men tend to express themselves through action, actually, which is why they're so concerned about men bottling up all of these feelings that will turn to violence. It's like, yeah, no, I agree, that's a genuine concern, and I'd like to avoid it. So how could we do that? Well, we could do that in a more human way. Back in like my grandfather's day, they would have something else that was just for men, that was more action oriented, to help them work through any emotions and any problems that they had, rather than expecting just a one-on-one struggle session, in which the pure verbal expression of feeling is considered sufficient to solve the problems, or to cathartically extirpate these emotional demons. I don't think it works that way for men. I know, having been a young man myself and having sons, no, that's not sufficient. It doesn't do the job. And actually, something more visceral, more you could say more caveman or something like that, is actually more appropriate, because men are not the same as women. Boys are not the same as girls. They learn differently, they play differently, and they express difficulty differently. And if we weren't in such a pathologically anti-male and pro-female society, we would understand that and be sympathetic to that.
Finally, what do you think? I know we've talked about this a lot in this interview, but just more broadly, what do you think about the influence of phones, social media, the internet, and so on young people in general, not just young boys, but young girls as well? Presumably, obviously, you said you've got young children, right? So I'm not sure what your policy is towards giving them the phone and the internet and so on, but a lot of parents are arguing, we need to restrict that or even ban it completely. I know someone like Miriam Cates would argue for that. What do you think about the influence broadly on young people today with the internet and social media?
I've yet to see any evidence that it's positive. I don't like it, and I think it's a bad thing. And I think that I personally would think that actually smartphones are the issue. Having a phone that you could just text and phone from would be fine. It'd be no different to having money for the phones when you were walking around as a kid. It's the ability to access the internet through the phone that's the problem, because of course you can do that unsupervised, and it's in fact difficult to supervise a kid when they're on their phone. It's not like they're sat at a big monitor or something that you can just look over their shoulder, and they can take it anywhere and do it when you're not with them, like at school or in the toilet or whatever it is. I don't think it's wise, and I would completely support a smartphone ban for under 16-year-olds. Just get an old Nokia brick that they can text from if you need to get in contact with them. I think that would be a good idea, because it's social media that is the issue as well. Probably having access to Google search, well, okay, not great because they could access something bad, but that's probably not the end of the world. It's the constant and immediate availability of everyone else on Earth that is bad. I mean, there are other things that are bad too, because, I mean, like Instagram is a great example, how it's destroying young women's self-esteem. Because if an Instagram model spends 6 hours setting up a perfect shot and spends a week starving herself to get a perfect shot, your average 13-year-old who's going through issues, all young women have body issues as their bodies change, because their bodies change in ways that are honestly quite dramatically different to young men's, and have, I think, a much more difficult impact, because the world changes more for a young woman than it does for a young man as you're growing up, especially in very intimate ways, and the way that people react to you. So being able to see incredibly beautiful women, a constant stream on social media, you're scrolling through your social media feed. I've seen just young women talking about it online, going, this is destroying my sense of self. And it makes them feel bad about themselves. Whereas if they had only their peers to compare themselves to, well, then they'd probably feel roughly, on average, how things should feel. But when they're instead comparing themselves to the most beautiful women who have ever lived, all in one place, well, you can understand why that would destroy someone's self-esteem. And it's the same with the bullying that we see in adolescence. I mean, you can get gangs of people who don't even live in your town bullying you online. And if you're 13, 14 years old, you don't really know how to deal with this. You don't really know what the procedure is, especially if your parents haven't themselves grown up with phones and don't have a tried and tested mechanism to deal with this kind of problem. You are very much on your own. And again, Adolescence actually portrays this really well when the son has to explain to the police officer what the emojis mean. Like, this is an alien world that there's no help from the adults from. And so it's kind of like a state of nature that our kids have been dropped into on the internet and said, right, good luck, fend for yourself, hope it turns out well, no one can help you. I think it's pretty irresponsible. And I think maybe in, like 100 years or something, when these things are as old as televisions are now, it'll probably be considered a form of abuse. The idea that, we bought all of our children smartphones and then just left them to it, that'll be considered deeply irresponsible